Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. This is part 7 of the Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge. And the emperor in the spotlight for part 7 is the Emperor Claudius, the fourth of the Roman emperors, the third of the Julio-Claudian emperors. That sounds confusing to you. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was of the Julian clan. He had married a woman who was a Claudian, and she brought with her from a previous marriage a son named Tiberius, who Augustus would then adopt. And so Tiberius has now he's of the Claudian clan, he's been adopted into the Julio clan, so Tiberius becomes the first Julio-Claudian emperor. The second emperor of Rome, the first Julio-Claudian, and then his nephew Gaius, better known as Caligula, becomes the second Julio-Claudian, and then along comes Claudius, the third of the Julio-Claudians, but the fourth emperor. He succeeded Caligula under rather unusual circumstances, and so let's begin with that. It was the 24th of January in the year 41 AD, or 41 of the Common Era if you prefer. The Emperor Gaius Caligula, he had left a public celebration in honor of his long dead but deified great-grandfather Augustus. Augustus had been declared a god upon his death. And so there had been this big public festival, and Caligula was there, and he left for reasons unknown. And he's moving down this series of hallways, kind of behind the scenes, these narrow hallways, and he's accompanied by some members of the Praetorian Guard, who were like the emperor's personal bodyguard, and also by a few senators and some other friends. Caligula also had hired an auxiliary bodyguard, these Germanic henchmen, big tough guys who kind of followed along behind. So as Caligula is going down this narrow hallway, there's a little room off to one side, and he looks inside the room and he sees some young Roman men practicing either a song or a dance or something they're going to do as part of the festivities. So Caligula stops to talk to them, and as he's talking to them, the tribune of the Praetorian Guard, Chaerea, pulls out a dagger and starts to stab Caligula. Then the other members of the Praetorian Guard begin to stab him as well. There's all kinds of confusion. There's an uproar. The Germanic bodyguards who are hanging back, they come rushing forward and they just start killing anybody they get their hands on. Some senators were killed. Some innocent bystanders were killed. What was going on? Certainly the motivation, this probably had a lot to do with Caligula's reputation by that time. There were a lot of people who wanted to see him dead. He had a kind of a depraved personality, engaged in a lot of demented activities. He had only been emperor for 3 years, and during that time he grotesquely mismanaged the empire. And there have been some previous attempts on his life. But the sources, the details and the rationale for this vary depending upon the source that you're reading, but they all agree that Chaerea was the first to stab Caligula, as if he had a personal grudge against him. One source says that he did. Caligula was constantly insulting Chaerea's honor and his masculinity. But anyway, there was little room for escape, and Caligula is killed and all this. But this was part of an organized event, because at the same time, some other members of the Praetorian Guard had entered the imperial household on top of the Palatine Hill, and they killed Caligula's wife at the time, Caesonia, and their young daughter Julia. Okay, and then, very curiously, another member of the guard by the name of Gratus, we don't know much else about this guy, he starts moving through the imperial household, and he finds Caligula's uncle Claudius either hiding in a closet or behind a curtain or something. And he very quickly escorts Claudius out of the imperial household over to the camp of the Praetorian Guard. And when he gets there, the Praetorians hail Claudius as emperor. Now, the Roman word emperor comes from the Latin imperator, which means conquering general. It wasn't an official title; it was an honorific. The legions, your troops, if you had led them into a great victorious battle or something like that, they would call out imperator. From this, the word emperor comes. Now, Claudius was not a military man by any means, but it was interesting that the Praetorian Guard took it upon themselves to name him the next emperor, because up to this point, to become emperor, you just had to inherit the office. Augustus deeded over the empire to his stepson Tiberius, and Tiberius then deeded it over to his nephew Caligula. But now here was the military announcing this. Now, what's interesting about this is, there was no formal legal mechanism for passing on the power of an emperor. This was like a legal fiction. The Roman law did not have anything for this, so this was as valid as any other way of becoming emperor. But there's a lot more to unpack here. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about our sources of information. What do we know about Claudius, and how do we know about him? Among our original Roman sources, we've got Suetonius, who's also our source of information for Julius Caesar, for Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. Suetonius is, he was late 1st century, early 2nd century. He's writing, 70 some odd years after Claudius's time. Suetonius had access to a lot of information lost to us. Suetonius is a very interesting, always entertaining historian, not always the most reliable. He loved gossip. He loved the sensational, but he is a source. A contemporary of Suetonius was a much more reliable historian by the name of Tacitus. He too wrote about the reign of Claudius, but the first part of his book on Claudius is missing. We've lost it. But we do get the second half of Claudius's reign up to his death. And Tacitus is a bit more sober an historian, so he gives us some very interesting information. There's a non-Roman source who comes along not even a generation later. His name is Josephus. He was part of the Jewish priestly class, fascinated by the Romans, and a very good historian in his own right. And he gives us some really interesting insights into Claudius. And then there are sources that come later. Dio Cassius is one from the 2nd century. Then after that, things kind of foggy, what's really happening here. But there were also a lot of coins that were minted during Claudius's reign. The Romans used coins in much the same way we do, as a means of exchange, buy goods. But the coins were always stamped with political messages. And so we've got coins from Claudius's time with his image on them, and sometimes there'll be an inscription that'll mention something about his reign or something that he had accomplished or something he had done. So that's a wonderful source. There are some old temples that were erected to Claudius's memory. He was deified upon his death, and sometimes there's some information there. Some of his speeches to the Senate are recorded. Tacitus gives us one of them, one of the longer ones. One of his speeches in particular was quite renowned, and it was copied out and chiseled on stone, on these stone slabs that were erected in various parts of the empire. One of them was found a while ago. It was found in the city of Lyon, and it purports to be the actual verbatim speech of Claudius to the Senate, giving honor to the Gauls and granting them Roman citizenship. The speech is kind of interesting because there's a lot of digressions in it. There's little fragments of some of his other speeches too, where he's very pedantic. He liked to engage in some cornball humor, which of course doesn't translate well, but we think there's some authentic voice there of him. So those are our ancient sources of information. And then of course there's the reconstructions of the past that, current historians do. Special mention here, back in the 1930s, the British classicist Robert Graves wrote two novels, I, Claudius and Claudius the God, which became very famous, bestsellers, fictionalized accounts of Claudius's reign. They're really good novels, really entertaining, a lot of fun. Graves knew his history. He did his research. He kind of softens some things. He makes Claudius look a little nicer, a little more helpless than he really was. This was then made into a BBC series in the 1970s. I remember watching it, and that's what really triggered my early interest in Roman history. But that's an honorable mention. Robert Graves' novelization of the life of Claudius. But he did his he did his research. So that's a pretty good source, an entertaining source anyway. So anyway, you put all this stuff together, and what do we get? Claudius was born on August 1st, 10 years before the Common Era, or 10 years before the Christian era, in Lyon, in Gaul. Gaul, modern-day France, was part of the Roman Empire at the time. His father was Nero Claudius Drusus, and his mother was Antonia. He had two older siblings, Livilla and Germanicus. Germanicus was a very famous and beloved Roman general. Claudius's maternal grandparents were Mark Antony, the same Mark Antony from the Antony Cleopatra thing, and his wife was Octavia, who was the sister of Augustus, who was the emperor. Okay, and Augustus, of course, was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. So if you want to trace that family line through, it means that Claudius was the great-great-grandnephew of Julius Caesar. His paternal parents were Livia, Augustus's third wife, and Tiberius Claudius Nero, who divorced Livia and then married Augustus. These family trees get very confusing, especially in the royal dynasties of Rome, because there's a lot of marriage and divorce and planned marriages, and it gets very complicated over time. Let's just say this about Claudius. He had a very distinguished lineage. He was right up there among the most powerful family in Rome at the time. However, he was never considered by his family to be a worthy successor to the purple, to becoming an emperor, largely because of his various physical afflictions. He walked with a very pronounced limp. Perhaps one leg was shorter than the other. He drooled uncontrollably. His head was always hanging to one side. When he got excited, he would stutter when he spoke, and sometimes it would be hard for him to kind of regain control of his speech. He had a tendency towards clumsiness. He may have had a bit of a curvature of the spine. Now, in ancient Roman society, which really valued physical appearance, this alone rendered him unfit to be an emperor or to be a leader of any kind, okay? And also in Roman society, physical disabilities or physical challenges were often seen as signs of perhaps mental challenges. He was regarded as simple, but he wasn't. And we know, physical challenges have nothing to do with your intelligence level. In our time, Stephen Hawking, one of the greatest scientific minds of all time, certainly had a whole slew of physical challenges, but did not affect his intellect. And in time, they'll discover that the same was true of Claudius. What was it that he was suffering from, though? Well, this is Barbara Levick's biography of Claudius. I use this a lot to research this particular video. Barbara Levick was a British historian specializing in the late Roman Republic and the early ages of the Principate. And this is one of the finest biographies of Claudius I've ever read. It's incredibly detailed. Levick was a real leader in the field. She just died a couple years ago, in 23, I think, at the age of 94, maybe. Anyway, a great historian. And so I used Levick a lot in putting this presentation together. And when it comes to Claudius's physical challenges, Levick seems, she pointed to, based on the information we have, the consensus now is that Claudius may have been suffering from some form of cerebral palsy. Although she noted something else too. In Suetonius tells us that when Claudius becomes emperor, a lot of these physical disabilities seem to go away, especially the stutter. So, there may have been some physical thing here, maybe some form of cerebral palsy, or some of it may have just been psychosomatic because he was treated so badly when he was young. And indeed, he was regarded as a fool. His own mother called him a monster. Couldn't stand to have her son around. She gave him over to his grandmother, Livia, who raised Claudius when he was very young. She was a little nicer to him, but she had him, she was assisted by a mule driver who was going to teach the young Claudius some personal physical discipline. There's some belief that he was the way he was because of laziness and a lack of willpower. At any rate, because he was never expected to amount to anything much, he was pretty much left alone to his own devices. By the time he reached his teen years, it was recognized by some that he did have, an interest in academic things. He loved to read histories and poetry. He was very well studied in Roman history. And in fact, the family had hired Livy, Titus Livius, the famous Roman historian, to be Claudius's personal tutor. And Livy himself noticed the kid has got some aptitude for history, analysis, and research in this. Before becoming emperor, Claudius, pretty much left alone, but given a pretty good education, began to write. And it seems like he was quite a prolific writer. He wrote a history of Rome down to his own time. He wrote 20 books of Etruscan history. The Etruscans were an ancient people that ruled northern Italy before Rome was even founded. Claudius also wrote 8 books of Carthaginian history. The Carthaginians were the people that Rome fought during the Punic Wars. So, and Claudius probably had accessed information long lost to us, but an 8-volume history of the Carthaginians and the Punic Wars. We're told he wrote an autobiography of himself. He was also interested in the Latin language, and he wrote a treatise recommending 2 new letters be added to the Roman alphabet. When Claudius becomes emperor, we find inscriptions from that time with these 2 new letters included, but it never caught on. And Rome just went back to the alphabet it had, which is pretty much our alphabet today. But that was kind of an interesting thing. He also wrote a book on dice playing. He loved to gamble. Now, all of these wonderful books that Claudius wrote are lost. We don't have any of them. Or unless they're stuck, hidden away in some archive of a medieval monastery in Europe somewhere. At this point, it's unlikely. They'd be quite a boon for historians to have some of these, but we just don't have them. As I mentioned, we do have, there was that famous speech he gave to the Senate, which was recorded, carved in stone, so we get a sense of his voice. As I mentioned, kind of pedantic. He digresses a lot in all this. But still, it would be really interesting to have had these writings. At any rate, when he's hailed as imperator by the Praetorian Guard, it's hard to gauge what the reaction to this was at the time. And why did the Praetorians choose him? That's a bit of a mystery. There's a couple different theories about this. One of them is the Praetorian Guard was created by Augustus and maintained by Tiberius and to some degree by Caligula. And so the Praetorians probably wanted to find someone within the Julio-Claudian family to be the next emperor so they can maintain their own legitimacy. That seems a pretty thin explanation. Another explanation I heard was that the Praetorians were perhaps plotting to take over the empire themselves, and they planned in advance to name Claudius the new emperor, thinking he was a fool, thinking he was mentally challenged, so they could manipulate and control him. Of course, it wouldn't turn out that way. But anyway, when the killing of Caligula spreads throughout the empire, everyone's in a great panic and all of this. And Claudius is then led out of the Praetorian camp with all the regalia of an imperator. And then he has to address the Senate and the people of Rome. And he was it doesn't seem like he was any part of this conspiracy or that he even wanted to be emperor. But he realized he had no choice. He's been hailed as emperor. He understands he's in this very precarious situation. What's occurred here is nothing short of a regicide. A regicide is when you kill a king. A regicide had happened, and Claudius has now been named the new emperor. And so he had to kind of acknowledge this. He couldn't be seen to have condoned the murder of Caligula. So he appointed a new Praetorian prefect. Carria, who was reported to have been the first one to stab Caligula, was ordered to be executed along with the other Praetorian guards who took part in the assassination. So Claudius is trying to legitimize what's happened here, showing that I had nothing to do with the murder of Caligula, who was Claudius's nephew. I said, I had nothing to do with that. I've ordered the execution of the men who did it, but I have been hailed the imperator. So he becomes a usurper, and he'll be seen like that by many throughout the rest of his reign. Now, Levick, she talks about how Claudius had to find the support of a great many different groups of people in Rome. And early on, some of his earliest supporters were probably people who served under Germanicus. Claudius was the younger brother of Germanicus, one of the most beloved Romans of the time. Germanicus at one time was believed to be earmarked to be the successor of Tiberius. Germanicus died under rather suspicious circumstances, but his memory was beloved, and he was a great hero among the Romans. Claudius was the younger brother of Germanicus, so perhaps some of Germanicus's followers, people who served under Germanicus, looked to Claudius as like a faint image of the great Germanicus, so they were probably willing to give Claudius the benefit of the doubt. Also, there were those who had benefited from Caligula's reign by way of wealth and status, and Claudius is a Julio-Claudian, so perhaps they gave him some support. But Claudius had to work to get the support of some other people, especially the Roman Senate. The Roman Senate was the one surviving political institution in all of Roman history. There was a Roman Senate when Rome was founded. The Senate was created. There was a Roman Senate all during the ages of the Republic. There'll be a Roman Senate until the fall of Rome. And the Roman senators were like the true Romans, the aristocrats here, the ones who protected Roman identity and Roman law and Roman tradition. Now, by the time of Caligula, or by the time of Claudius, the Roman Senate had been debased. They had been forced to grovel before Tiberius and Caligula. But Claudius was a man of tradition. And he wanted to win over the Senate and get their support. And it would seem that at first the Senate was kind of ambiguous about this. In fact, there might have even been a couple of conspiracies to assassinate Claudius. We don't have any detailed information on these other than that these conspiracies were revealed early on and the conspirators had been executed. But Claudius, nonetheless, he respected the Senate because he was an historian. He knew the history of the Senate, and he was very deferential towards them. When the senators walked into the room, he would rise to greet them, which is a sign of great respect. He always addressed the senators with tremendous civility and honesty, almost bowing before them. Suetonius tells a very charming story about an elderly Roman senator who was very hard of hearing. And when the Senate was debating an important issue, Claudius brought this senator up in the front row so he could hear better what was going on. But again, this was a sign of this deference. Does he win over the Senate? Yeah, maybe a little bit. It's really hard to gauge. But they do, in important points in Claudius's life, they do rally around him. So he kind of wins them over a little bit. But his true admirers, or the people that he really won over to his side, were the Roman people themselves, the common folk, and the military. Those two groups become the real source of his support. As far as his courting the support of the people of Rome, as emperor, Claudius took extensive measures to make sure the grain supply was always, the food supply was always maintained for the Romans. Those grain barges coming up from Egypt the way was always cleared for their entrance, and the grain was processed, and the Romans had a food dole for the poor, and Claudius always made sure there was plenty of grain for everybody. The aqueducts were carefully maintained that brought fresh water into the city. In fact, one of the aqueducts had been completed during Claudius's reign. We'll talk about that shortly. It's one of the wonders of the ancient world. The city had a fire brigade that had kind of fallen into disuse, but he kind of revitalized that. He really enjoyed sponsoring games and entertainments for the Roman people. The Roman people loved this kind of stuff, and he would mix with the crowds. He would be in there cheering with the crowds, making cornball jokes with the people and all of this. And the people loved this. He was like he was their emperor, but he's one of them as well. This was a real contrast to Caligula, who was terrifying because he was so unpredictable, and of course Tiberius, who was completely stingy. The fact that Claudius was mixing with the common people at the entertainments reminded them of the deified Augustus, who did the same thing. All right. And so Claudius worked very hard to maintain his visibility among the Roman people, and the Romans appreciated this greatly. except in one area. When Augustus was emperor, he made it a point to sit in on the courts and as a judge and give his judgment on various cases. And of course, this gave Augustus a reputation for a man of great justice and mercy and all of this. Tiberius continued on with that, but Tiberius did it grudgingly. He didn't really care for this. Caligula was just too frivolous. Claudius comes along and he kind of restarts this custom. He wants to sit in on the courts too, but as Levick notes, and I'm quoting Levick here, his conduct on the bench was one of his most severely criticized activities. He was really good at winning over the crowds at the entertainments, but when it came to doling out justice as a judge in the courts, he often seemed distracted. He was more interested in the minutia of cases. The Romans had a pretty sophisticated legal system. In fact, that was one of the great legacies of ancient Rome. They understood the principles of law and the theory behind it. And they, in any legal case, both sides had to be heard, this kind of thing. Claudius, he would listen to one side of the case and then make his judgment. Sometimes he would make a judgment, he would interrupt someone as they were giving testimony and give his judgment. And so, quite often his judgments were inconsistent. And sometimes he was very merciful, other times he was brutally cruel and everything else. So the Roman people loved him, but they didn't like him taking part in legal cases. But he continued to do it. It's just kind of an interesting little weird thing here. And it might speak to his physical ailments. Perhaps he couldn't concentrate enough on what was happening to listen to a long legal argument. But anyway, but generally speaking, the Roman people did come to love him a great deal. As far as the military, keeping in mind it was the Praetorian Guard who killed Caligula. And Claudius, the lesson he learned from this is you got to maintain the loyalty of the troops. But Augustus knew this as well. Tiberius knew it, again, grudgingly. Caligula just humiliated the guards. But Claudius worked very hard to win over the loyalty of the troops, giving them kind of a raise, a special bonus when he came to power, and all of this. And so from the very beginning, he emphasized how much he relied on the military, how much he admired them and respected them, cash advances and everything else. And indeed, this might have something to do with why Claudius led a military expedition into Britain. The Romans had already been there under Julius Caesar, but Caesar, if his plan had been to conquer Britain, he wasn't able to carry that through because he had to rush back to Rome because of some political situation that was happening. And the Romans had not returned to Britain, but Claudius goes, and he goes with the troops. He's marching with the troops, and they get to Britain, and his personal appearance was like the climax of this expedition. And he was hailed as the conqueror of Britain in the year 43, certainly the high point of Claudius's reign. And I want to quote from Levick again. She says that the conquest of the island was a stroke of elegance and power for a new and underestimated emperor, and its effect on the minds of his subjects, as its fame washed through the empire and rippled even to the remotest provinces, was incalculable. This is what made Claudius's reputation with the military and with the Roman people. This is what made him so beloved. Now, I should add, though, even though Britain was now declared part of the empire, it wasn't pacified yet. That would be a few more decades. There'd be a lot of uprisings. A couple of other emperors would come and go. But Claudius was hailed as the conqueror of Britain. And he wins the great respect of the military as a result of this. This also had something to do with his his inclination to expanding the Roman frontiers. We know during his reign, Claudius had annexed territory in North Africa and in northern Greece. When Herod Agrippa of Judea, the king of the Jews, had died, he made Judea a province. He also supported Roman control of Armenia. So he's winning the military, he's winning the people, he's expanding the size of the empire. On balance, Claudius's reign was more beneficial to the empire than scandalous. He was a very effective administrator. Some have even called some of his actions and reforms kind of enlightened. Make a little list of them here. Although he was a bad judge, he was bad sitting in courts, he did introduced some reforms to the Roman judicial system. Some of this stuff is pretty arcane, but it was designed to guarantee a greater awareness of the legal principles behind Roman law. He extended Roman citizenship to various groups out in the hinterland. He encouraged urbanization in the parts of the empire where there had never been cities before. These Roman encampments are built, and they become cities in their own right. He revitalized the Roman religious traditions, supporting these ancient priesthoods and rituals that had fallen into disrepair. And this is a big thing. I would remind you, there's no such thing as separation of church and state at the time. To make sure you're worshiping the gods was very important to the Romans. And the fact that some of these ancient gods were being ignored made the Romans very nervous. So Claudius kind of revitalized all that business. He had what we would think of as, the president has a cabinet of advisors. Claudius had a cabinet too of friends, and he would bestow honors on them and other heads of branches of the government and all of this. In his public works, I mentioned, the grain supply. There was always plenty of food coming into Rome, and also the construction of a new harbor at Ostia. Ostia is a port city about 20 miles from Rome. It's right on the coast. The Tiber River, of course, is the river that courses through Rome, and the Tiber River then heads out, and when it dumps into the Mediterranean, the opening there, the mouth of the river, is where the city of Ostia was. So Ostia was the first port coming into Rome. If you're bringing goods into Rome, you pass through the port of Ostia. And Claudius did not think the city was in good enough condition to be the main port of Rome. So he really had like an urban renewal project. And you can still visit some of this today. So that was a big thing with him. And then, of course, the famous Roman aqueducts, the most famous being the Aqua Claudia, named for him. They started this during the reign of Caligula, but it was completed under Claudius and with his encouragement and all of this. This aqueduct brought water from the town of Subiaco, which is about 43 miles away from Rome, into the city, crossed a variety of landscapes, through valleys and hills and mountains. At one point, it even went underground a little bit and came back up above ground. The Romans understood hydraulics pretty well because they kept the water flowing. At a certain length of the aqueduct was 90 feet in the air, 90 feet in the air carrying water and then splashing down into the city, into the fountains and everything else. It's been estimated that it carried 6.5 million cubic feet of water into Rome every day. For about the next 400 years, this was the main aqueduct into the city. And Claudius, was given great honors and credit for this. So, a lot of good things for Rome under Claudius. And a little interesting side note here. Claudius, it was during the reign of Claudius that we start to hear about Christianity, or Christianity comes to the notice of the imperial government, it would seem. In Suetonius, there's a little passage in Suetonius where he mentions something rather odd. Rome at the time of Claudius had a population probably over 1 million, which would have made it the largest city in the world at the time. And like any large city, which was the center of an empire which was multicultural, the city of Rome had different neighborhoods. There's the Egyptian neighborhood, there's the Greek neighborhood, and there was a Jewish part of town. And at some point during the reign of Claudius, riots erupted in the Jewish neighborhoods. And Claudius got so upset by this, he ordered the Jews to be exiled from the city, and then later on they're welcomed back in. But what was triggering the riots? Suetonius says the riots were the result of someone named Chrestus. But he gives us no more information about this, and we never hear about Chrestus again. Some people reading this see in the name Chrestus, it looks like the word Christ, but it's misspelled. There's a theory here that what had happened was Jesus' ministry and whatever happened after that, it had happened a couple of decades before Claudius comes on the scene. But by the time Claudius comes on the scene, Christianity is starting to spread a little bit through the empire. It's still a kind of a weird little cult, but and it's still a Jewish cult. It's a Jewish thing. And there's a belief that some Jewish Christians may have arrived in Rome, went into the Jewish neighborhoods and began to preach to the Jews. that your Messiah has come. And the Jews rejected this. Big fights break out in riots. And so, Claudius exiles everybody for a time. And so we think what Suetonius is writing, Suetonius misunderstood what he read or what he heard about this. And he was hearing Christ, but he thought it was the name of someone named Christus. Christus, Christ. It's interesting, Levick kind of rejects this as evidence of Christianity, early Christianity in the city of Rome. But and she rejects it only because there's nothing else to substantiate this story. I wouldn't be so quick to reject it. Something is happening here, but nothing more is said about it. As far as Claudius's relationship to the Jews, though, it was pretty progressive for the time. Beginning with Julius Caesar, the Jews were allowed certain rights and privileges. They were allowed to worship their one God, which the Romans always kind of had a problem with that. But Claudius did reaffirm that. And there was a large Jewish population in Alexandria that was constantly being persecuted by the Egyptians. Claudius kept ordering the Egyptians and the Jews get along with each other, stop the fighting. So his relations with the Jews was quite advanced. He had a respect for them, but there's just this weird incident that occurs, and some people think it was a sign of the Christians in Rome during Claudius's reign. So anyway, as I said, on balance, his reign was pretty good, pretty beneficial to the empire as a whole. However, in his private life, there were some problems. He had been married 4 times, not unusual for a Roman aristocrat then. His first wife, this was a teenage marriage. Her name was Plautia. She belonged to an Etruscan family, an old Etruscan family. It was known that Claudius could read Etruscan. The Etruscan language is lost to us, and it was almost lost in Claudius's time. But if you recall, I mentioned that he wrote a history of the Etruscans. Where did he get his information, and how did he learn how to read Etruscan? Well, he had an Etruscan wife, or a young lady who was descendant of an old Etruscan family. So there's something going on there. He had a son with Plautia. The son was named Claudius Drusus. When Claudius Drusus was a teenager, apparently he was hanging out with his friends and they're snacking on fruits and things, and he's cutting up a pear and tossing pieces of the pear into the air, catching them in his mouth, and one goes down his throat into his esophagus and suffocates him. So he died of asphyxiation. Very tragic thing. We're told Claudius was just beside himself with sadness and everything else. At any rate, Claudius, he ends up divorcing his first wife on grounds of adultery. He marries a second time, Aelia. She was the adopted sister of Sejanus. Now, this is before Claudius became emperor, okay? Sejanus was the Praetorian Guard who conspired against Tiberius. The conspiracy was discovered. Sejanus and his fellow conspirators were executed. It's perhaps for that reason that Claudius then divorced his wife, his second wife, Aelia, because she had been connected to Sejanus in some way. So those are the first 2 wives. Plautia, who he divorces because of infidelity. Aelia, who may have been divorced because of suspicion, the cloud of suspicion around her because she was related to Sejanus. Then we come to wife number 3 and wife number 4, and this is where things get strange. His third wife was Valeria Messalina. She was about 15 years old when Claudius married her. Claudius, by this time, is emperor. She's about 15, he's 47. Now, that's pretty scandalous by our standards, and certainly she's underage. But in Roman society, in Roman culture, this was pretty common for an older aristocrat to marry a very young woman, a girl, in fact. The idea is to have as many children as possible, mortality rates being what they were. You have 10 kids and 2 of them survive. At least the name can be carried on. The family property doesn't have to get lost. So it's shocking to us, but at that time in Rome, it met within the standards more or less. However, she was quite notorious for leading a very promiscuous life, even after she had married Claudius. Pliny the Elder, one of the great encyclopedists of Roman history, he tells us that at one time there had been a party and Messalina had entered into a competition with a famous Roman prostitute to see who could have the most sexual partners within a 24-hour period. and Messalina won the contest. Pliny says she took on 25 partners within a 24-hour period, so that's another one man every hour, I guess. Later sources keeps upping the number, clearly slandering Messalina. But it's also said that she had a great many lovers. It's almost impossible to substantiate any of this kind of stuff. For whatever reason, it's smearing her reputation as a woman who is just guided only by her own lust. Levick, though, points out something kind of interesting. We know the names of some of Messalina's lovers, and these were Roman senators and people of these old Roman money and aristocratic families. And Messalina might have been doing this, using her sexuality as a way of blackmailing people and lining her own pockets, because she would threaten these men. I'm going to tell my husband, the emperor, that you raped me unless you give me half of your fortune, and this kind of thing. So there might have been something more going on here than simple promiscuity. Or, I'm sorry, simple, lustful behavior and all of that. With Claudius, they had a son, and the son was, they had a daughter, but there was a son named Tiberius Claudius Germanicus, notice the names, who would later be known as Britannicus. After the year 43, when Claudius was credited with conquering Britain, he was given the name Britannicus, but he never used it. But he gave it to his young son. He was very fond of the young son, the young boy. So he had a son named Britannicus. Okay. And then what happens is around the year 48 or so, Claudius was at Ostia, remember the harbor? And he's overseeing the remodeling and the rebuilding of this great harbor. And while he was away from Rome, Messalina had some kind of party, and during the party, she married her current lover, Gaius Salius, in a public ceremony. Salius was he's a Roman senator, known for his good looks and his incredible ambition. Sources challenge the validity of this marriage, or if it even really happened. There was no sign that Messalina had informed Claudius that she wanted a divorce. And by Roman law, if there's to be a divorce, the spouse wanting the divorce first who has to inform the spouse that he or she is divorcing. And she had never informed Claudius that she wanted the marriage to come to an end. There's another version of the story that there was kind of a Bacchic festival taking place, kind of a bacchanal. And as part of this festival, there was a ritual symbolic marriage. And so it was a symbolic marriage with Salius. So it wasn't even meant to be real, but it was really questionable what was going on. Was this an attempt to overthrow Claudius in some way? But it certainly brought dishonor upon him. When Claudius was informed of this, he's still at Ostia. He immediately rushes back to Rome. As he's approaching the city, Messalina comes out to greet him with the two kids. And she's saying, please, dear, whatever you've heard, it isn't true. And she was accompanied by a Vestal Virgin who begged Claudius, don't be too rash in your judgment here. And Claudius starts to soften a little bit. He goes, I'll tell you what, I'm really tired from the journey. It's been a very stressful time for me. I'm going to get some rest. We can discuss this in the morning. Somewhere in there, one of Claudius's advisors by the name of Narcissus, for some reason, thought that Claudius had given him the order to execute Messalina. Claudius goes back to the imperial household, takes a nap, and while he's napping, Narcissus, with some other guards, they nab Messalina, and they take her out to a public garden, and they give her the option, kill yourself or we will kill you. And she decides to kill herself. She can't quite muster up the strength to stab herself, and so the guards just run her through and they kill her. The next morning, when Claudius was informed of this, his reaction was kind of odd. He's like, well, that's too bad. And then he finishes his breakfast without any further comment. So something went weird here. Salius and others involved in this were also executed. So that was the end of his third wife. Then he marries a fourth time. His fourth wife was Julia Agrippina, better known as Agrippina the Younger. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus. She was the daughter of Germanicus. And if you recall, Germanicus was the brother of Claudius, meaning Agrippina the younger, Claudius's fourth wife, was also Claudius's niece. Claudius was her uncle. Now, this was contrary to Roman law, but Claudius changed the law so he could marry his niece, and they were married in the year 49. Now, why he did this has never been made clear. At any rate, Agrippina comes across as ruthless, ambitious, and domineering. She had been married before, and she had a son by her first husband. And her first husband was Gnaeus Domitius Enobarbus, and he had died. And so then she marries Claudius, and she brings her son from the previous marriage. The son's name was Lucius. He was born in 37 or so. When Claudius marries her, he adopts her son. And in Roman society, usually an adoption was accompanied by a change of name. So Agrippina's son, by her previous marriage, was adopted by Claudius, and he was renamed Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Now you can hear all the names in there. Germanicus, of course, Augustus, Caesar, Claudius, his own name. But the first name, the praenomen, was Nero. Nero wasn't really a name. It was a title. It came from the Sabine language. The Sabine language was an Italian dialect that would eventually be completely eclipsed by Latin. But Nero means powerful or strong or something like this. And yes, this is the future Emperor Nero. Now we're told that Agrippina, she schemed in every way possible to alienate Claudius's son by Messalina Britannicus and further the cause of her own son Nero to become the next emperor. And Nero was a couple years older than Britannicus. And then Claudius dies very suddenly, the age of 63, on the 13th of October in 54 AD. A lot of Romans suspected that Agrippina had poisoned Claudius. Get him out of the way. We're told that Claudius's death was not announced right away. There seemed to be a delay of a day or two, and then the announcement is made, and Agrippina says, I've got Claudius's will and testament here. And the title of imperator is going to our son Nero. Britannicus will be co-ruler. And then a couple days later, Britannicus dies, and Nero becomes the next emperor. And of course, all kinds of suspicion here. The night before Claudius had died, he had been at a big family dinner kind of thing, and Agrippina was feeding him mushrooms, his favorite treat. And they think that she had poisoned the mushrooms and then, of course, poisoned Britannicus in some way to ensure that Nero would become, her son would become the next emperor. And that's exactly what happened. So this brings us to the reign of the Emperor Nero. Levick, one of her final statements in her book, she says, and so a new generation was growing up, the struggle for power went on, and rivals continued to be eliminated. So this brings us to the end of the reign of Claudius and to our next emperor, Nero. Those of you who are interested in any kind of, want to do some reading about Nero before I post my next video on my Roman Emperors Reading Challenge, this is a great scholarly work by Miriam Griffin called Nero, the End of a Dynasty. He'll be the last of the Julio-Claudians. This is heavy in scholarship. It's really, really good. If you'd like something a little broader, or more popular audience. This is Anthony Everitt's biography of Nero. Everitt's written a lot of biographies of some great Romans. He's a great writer. He does his research, but he writes for a very broad audience. I haven't read this yet. I'm going to read this as I prepare for my next video in this series. So this Nero. If you want to get a little background before you dive into Nero, you can always read some of the works of Seneca. Seneca was the great Roman Stoic. Seneca is an interesting character. He would become Nero's private tutor. We'll be talking about him when I post my video on Nero. But this is letters from a Stoic by Seneca. Very good, very interesting. And to get in this, you might get a sense of the kind of stuff that Nero was hearing when he was young and being taught by Seneca. This is a fairly recent book, Rome is Burning by Anthony Barrett. One of the major events that occurs during Nero's reign, of course, is the burning of Rome. And so I haven't read this. I'm going to read this. I'm probably going to start this tonight. But this will give you some nice background. Nero was a really interesting Roman emperor. You're not going to have any trouble finding books about him or books about things that occurred while he was emperor. One of my favorites is a novel that was published back in 1893 by Henryk Sienkiewicz. I think I'm mangling his name here. The novel is called Vadis. I had done a video on this quite a few months ago. It's a wonderful novel, and Nero, it's a novel, it's a work of fiction, but Nero he's one of the major characters in this, a fictionalized version of Nero, but the author did his research, and he does a nice job on this. So if you want some nice fun fiction to read, some historical fiction, I recommend Quo Vadis. A little background on Nero's time as emperor. Rome is burning. That's a good one. And what Roman thought was at the time, at least according to Seneca. You've got his letters from a Stoic. And this will be the main book I'll be using for my as I'm preparing for my next installment in the Roman Emperor's Reading Challenge. So that's it for now. Keep reading, hang in there, and take good care of yourselves.